And we're going to be talking all about this concept of bulking is BS. And we've broached some of these topics briefly in the previous discussion, but now we want to dive a bit further into those. And so one of the myths you referenced earlier, Professor Phillips, was around this concept of protein will make women bulky, quote unquote, is the common word that's thrown around on social media, or this idea that this is in some way even a problem. Can you maybe just revisit some of what you discussed in that myths and misconception piece, but maybe add a bit of context to it for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are certain sports, and you could look at certain positions within certain sports where bulk per se, so mass per se, is a good thing. American style football is an example where offensive and defensive linemen, they're just big human beings, and it doesn't matter as much about how much muscle or how much fat they have. So they're just in it for bulk. But I think that most people probably realize is that those guys lift a lot of weights. Similarly, if you look at women playing in the Rugby World Cup, which we've got going on right now, there are some women in that sport. They're not bulky and big. They are bigger because they lift weights. They're strong as well. So I think there's a distinction between just getting bigger and bulking, between what you gain is muscle. And that's a phenomenon that's driven by lifting weights. It's not a phenomenon driven by protein at all.
And we'll dive into some of those mechanisms. But first, Professor Elliott-Sale, one of the things I think is worth heading off is, I think most people now will have an appreciation that in a lot of studies, and particularly in sports science, we have maybe traditionally an underrepresentation of female participants, or studies that maybe are female only. However, there's sometimes this extreme position then people see pop up online of there's no studies in women whatsoever. Can you maybe tell us what the actual state of the evidence is?
I think we are living proof on the stage that there is some research being conducted in this area. I think we've all conducted studies on this particular topic. So I feel like that's a little lazy. I understand why people say it. I'll come back to that in a second, but it is lazy. There are studies that have been conducted looking at women. I think looking at women could be unpicked further. Is it that you are interested in different phases of the menstrual cycle? Are you interested in hormonal contraceptive users, pregnant athletes, older master athletes who are maybe perimenopausals? When people say I'm interested in women, I always say, like, which type of woman? So that's what I mean, like we're quite different in our profiles. So let me go back to when I said I understand why people say there's no evidence. What they should actually say is there's a lot less evidence in women. They have historically been overlooked, particularly in sports science. Again, I'm not a sociologist, but I think maybe we could even consider that from a supply and demand. Look at I think it was the 1902, don't quote me on the exact year, 1902 Olympics in Paris. 2% of the participants were women. Fast forward, as Professor Phillips said, we've reached parity now. So last year, 2024 in Paris, we got parity in participation. So it's taken, more than 100 years to go from that 2% to 50%. So maybe we could argue that sports science has been built, or more traditionally, investigating men, but there were more men taking part. Doesn't make it the right thing to do, but I think, we're starting to turn our attention there. So one more nuance. I'm all about the nuance today. So there is less evidence maybe on a supply and demand. There's less evidence maybe because there's been women are too complicated. We're not complicated, we're really interesting. So there's less evidence, but here's the last bit of nuance, is that I'm very open, I'm excited to see the new evidence coming through, but we really need high quality evidence. So when it comes to research using women as participants, or studying female athletes, it's underfunded. And so you try and do a lot on a little, and I think we've got to be careful not to do low quality work, because for the practitioners in the room, you want high quality data that the scientists are saying it's robust, it's credible, it's trustworthy, and you should change your practice based on that. And so if we just do more of any quality, then we're not giving you what you need. So I think we need more, and we need that more to be high quality.
One thing that Professor Phillips mentioned earlier was around that men and women have the basically same ability to build muscle. Dr. Helms, can you maybe speak to some of the evidence we have on this, to this concept, and maybe fill in some of those gaps of how do we distinguish that, what evidence we're basing that on?
Yeah, we've actually got a pretty robust set of evidence on this. There was a 2020 meta-analysis, and then there's a more recent one in 2024. Meta-analysis is just when we take all of the trials on a given topic, put them together, and we then try to get a summary statistic of that. And this is really important in the field of sports nutrition and sports science because we don't have the funding, like Dr. Sale was talking about, of the medical field, where you might have a multi-site 10,000 person study and you can get a very robust estimate of the data. We have 10-person studies and we can kind of cobble that together. But there's actually some really big data sets. There's one particular study on resistance training. That's called the FAMOUS study, which is some ridiculous acronym. It was done in the 2000s, still data coming out from it. And I think collectively now it's got over 1,300 participants or so. And they looked at the percentage changes in muscle mass, and that's actually included in these meta-analyses. That's just one of the studies. So what we see is exactly what was mentioned before. While you see absolute higher levels of muscle mass gained in men compared to women in terms of kilograms of size or mass, the relative change, the percentages are actually quite similar when you look at things. And we do see an interesting phenomenon if we want to talk about strength, where the lower body strength percentage changes are quite similar between men and women, but upper body strength on average actually increases more in women. And then the question is, going back to your sociological comment, is why? And even when we do research on untrained participants, it doesn't necessarily mean that not having performed resistance training puts you at the same state when you live in society. So is it a true sex difference? Or is it a systematic difference between what we would classify as an untrained man or woman? So for example, in the US, in the FAMOUS study, they observed this, different rates of strength gain. For the longest time, and still to this day, much different participation rates in high school of sport. And back when the participants who were in the 2000s were participating in the study, 2/3 to 75% rates in women versus men. And importantly, in the States, American football, strength and conditioning was the first sport that really embraced, football was the first sport that really embraced strength and conditioning. In football, you're getting up off the ground, you're standing up, you're pushing, you're pulling. There's much more upper body involvement, and they're actually training with weights. So even though you're an untrained participant 10 years later, when you are in this study, you're probably going to see some systematic differences between the men and women who are quote unquote untrained. So when you are untrained and you start training, you make faster initial gains, neuromuscular adaptations, you learn the skill. And if you take a whole bunch of people and some of them, I used to lift in high school, or I used to play football, or I did push-ups, that kind of thing, that's enough to see some kind of systematic difference when you have these big data sets. But is that a true sex difference? Is that because of estrogen? Is that because of testosterone? Probably not. I can't prove to you that it's not, but I can say that in terms of the actual potential to put on muscle mass, very similar percentage changes.
And not to pull us off topic, but there's a kind of similar discussion going on now in the injury and rehab world, right, around injury rates within female athletes. And it's maybe not a sex difference, but rather the general physical preparedness before that of the exposure because of society to different sports and so on earlier. So there's something that aligns with as much as you were saying.
And it even happens when later in life, like we don't have parity in the workforce. There's something like 20% of manual laborers are women and 80% are men. So as a researcher, you have to set parameters for, I'm recruiting trained or untrained participants, and that means X, Y, and Z. But you typically can't go, and I'm not recruiting manual laborers. Actually, the FAMOUS study did. They specifically said, we're not recruiting people who have resistance training-like jobs, which they didn't define, which bothers me as a researcher. But I'm like, that's cool. They try to control for that. So you have to be aware of these nuances, because if we're going to say something as important as there are these fundamental differences between men and women, and therefore they should train differently, and we're going to increase the barrier to entry, make it more complex in a world that's already quite complex, confusing, and overwhelming us with information, you better have damn good reason to do so.
One of the things that was mentioned earlier, I think by Professor Phillips, was around this concept that, if someone just starts consuming lots of protein, it's not going to magically cause someone to gain a lot of muscle. So there's a bit to unpack here, and maybe I'll start again with you, Dr. Helms here. Can you maybe let us know from the overview level, if it's not just drinking more protein can let me gain muscle, what are the actual drivers of muscle growth?
Yeah. So at a high level for like a practitioner or a lifter, it's like what you do in the gym. And then, if I want to speak to it from the researcher perspective, it's how does that actually connect to muscle physiology? And I won't do that to you. So what we're going to do is we're just going to talk about what are the main things in the gym. And it's two big things. It's how hard are you training, which we would define as proximity to failure. Not necessarily how heavy you lift, but did you take the given load you're working with, and in that set, did you get to the point where, I probably could have only done a few more reps? And then, okay, that's a unit, a set of training. How much of that did you do? So it is volume and then effort. If we want to define effort as proximity to failure, they're the two big training variables in the gym that results in hypertrophy long term.
Fantastic. Professor Phillips, if we talk about protein as being part of that recovery process or of building muscle, again, another area where there's lots of strange claims people have come across, that maybe there's specific types of protein supplements that are for women versus men, or they need different amounts of protein purely on a sex-based difference. Can you maybe speak to some of the things that you maybe have come across, have been asked about, and how you can maybe set the record straight on some of them?
I'm not a marketing person, but I understand the phenomenon is known as pink washing. Yep. So we take male products and we repackage them and sell them to women and put them in pink packages because, of course, women like pink things. But I think, again, if you've listened to everything that we've said this afternoon, the same rules apply. Relative to basically body weight, or if we had a measure maybe relative to muscle mass, all of the recommendations we've made around protein would be exactly the same for women as they would be for men. I realize on social media that there's a big push right now for women in perimenopause to consume more protein, but I can say again unequivocally that there's no evidence to suggest that their protein needs would be any different than a man going through that same age range in their life. So between 45 and 55, where about 95% of women go through menopause. So it's age, how much you weigh, and then you've got the requirements. They're exactly the same.
Professor Elliott-Sale, if we return to some of your experiences with athletes and maybe the concerns they come to you about or questions they ask you about that maybe relate to how they are training or how they're going to consume protein or their overall quality of diet relating to some of these issues around muscle. What are some of those that you most commonly have to address with them and how do those conversations tend to go?
I'm going to go back again. Sorry, I'm a bit like a broken record. Most of the conversations hinge around a phased-based approach. How should I train based on my phases? What should I eat based on my phases? And maybe I'll take this answer in a slightly different direction. Obviously, I showed you the figure at the start of this particular segment, and those hormones are fluctuating sometimes daily, sometimes weekly. And, it's difficult to navigate that. I can't tell on any given day what my estrogen concentration is. I can't tell by looking at a female athlete what her progesterone concentration is. So a lot of the time, we have to break it down and show them how they might navigate their menstrual cycle. So we tell them about, they should make a note on the calendar how often they bleed. So that gives them phase 1. They could look at if they're consistently ovulating, and that gives them sort of phase 2 and phase 3. And then if they really can do this within the applied setting, they can look at their progesterone concentration to see about phase 4. And so by doing that allows them to navigate through the cycle. And that way then you can start to test things against those phases. Because if you don't measure these things, you don't know what phase you're in, and you then obviously can't make that decision about your performance or about your nutrition. I would say that the conversation usually starts with, if you do this, it will give you really good information about your health. Okay, because we know if you ovulate, that means you've got good high peak in estrogen, and we know that's good for bone health, cognition, and so on. If you've got good progesterone, maybe flipping that and looking at fertility, it's good for the lining of your womb. So we reframe the conversation into, this gives you great information about your reproductive health and your general health. It allows you then to navigate the phases, and then, and only at that point, can we start to test your performance once we know for sure that you're in these particular phases. And usually by the time we we get to that point of the conversation or that point of the journey that we're on together, we make these measurements. And I can tell you in 25 years, I have not seen a consistent or universal response. So consistent within an individual that every time she hits that phase, this is her muscle strength. So there's no consistency there within an athlete. And I don't see it as a universal response. So when I take in 10 women as a sample, they're not all having the same response. So those conversations are around, navigating the cycle, what information you get about your health, and then, checking your performance against that.
One of the things that everyone accepts is that there's individual differences in training response, but sometimes what can occur when we note something where there may be some type of sex-based difference is that that's the only thing that's focused on as opposed to the individual athlete, or there's other factors more important. One of the things you said, Dr. Helms, might be a good example of this, where you noted we do see evidence where with upper body strength, relatively speaking, women may see greater gains in upper body strength. And for a while, there was almost people taking that information and saying, any female athlete I have, I need to give them much higher volume of upper body training than any male athlete that I have, as opposed to thinking about, well, other ways that we typically, for all athletes, determine if they suit low, moderate, or high training volumes. Can you maybe speak to some of what was going on and maybe some context for a better way to make decisions for your athletes?
Absolutely. And you just have to think through, okay, well, why don't we see a difference in lower body strength? And then we look at female participation rates and what sports they're doing. It's, volleyball, basketball, track and field. It's sports where there's a lot of jumping and running, and all of us walk around. So there's a certain training age in the lower body that's maybe a little more similar between the sexes. So this is one of those things where it's like, is there a true physiological difference? There might be. There could be, through puberty, a different distribution that persists so that you have more capacity to build muscle or strength in the upper body because of the relative distribution of muscle mass. But even then, it comes down to individualization. Autoregulation, coaching, what it is seeing what's in front of you and making a change. And you're more likely to make an error by making an assumption about how someone's going to respond than actually being reactive and having a monitoring system in place with how to do that on an individual basis. Every good coach, every good sports scientist, every good high-performance program, it is a integrated, iterative, back and forth process where we try something, we see how it goes, we bring it back. And, we had an Olympian on stage talking about that process. You can't wait until you have the meta-analysis when you're at that high level, and you do need to care about the singular piece of data that matters. It's not the summary statistic of the population. It's what happened on Tuesday, what happened on Wednesday, how did I feel about it, and then what patterns and cycles do I have? So ultimately, any good coach is creating systems. And autoregulation, I think, sometimes gets talked about as intuitive training. And it's good to have intuition and body awareness. I think that's the mark of a high-level athlete. But autoregulation is a systematic approach to individualizing your training. So it's based on objective markers, or at least quantitative markers of something subjective that are reliable. Ultimately, to answer your question, you need to make decisions based upon the athlete in front of you, independent of their sex, knowing that their sex will impact, some of these things. So if you have an athlete with a menstrual cycle, that's going to go into that sheet. It's going to look a little different. You're going to run that data. If they don't have a menstrual cycle, then you're probably not going to ask about PMS symptoms. But it doesn't mean that you wouldn't have the exact same process with different inputs to get the output.
Yeah, those things will emerge from that process
Yes.
that coaches should have in place regardless. So as we wrap up this section, maybe I'll turn to each of you for your maybe key takeaway from what we've discussed about this. I'll start with Professor Phillips and we'll work down. So a key takeaway you would want to make sure people really take from what we've discussed.
Yeah, I hope that one of the key takeaways is that given we've got gender parity now and women's sports is on the rise just about everywhere, we've got a professional ice hockey league in Canada, which is the only sport Canadians care about. Athletes can achieve great things, and it's a great time to be around as a researcher to see the research rising up in this area. And hand on heart, we thought for a lot of years we didn't include women because the menstrual cycle was a barrier. We're beginning to see that that's not the case now. So good times lie ahead.
Fantastic. Dr. Helms.
Yeah, make sure that you have a system. Every good coach has a monitoring practice and a way of giving the individual the best possible way of being the best version of themselves. And while we all are very different from our sex to our ethnicity, to our age, to our height, to our genetics, we don't want to make assumptions about that, but rather have a system to respond to how those things play out in the environment.
And Professor Elliott-Sale?
Well, because I'm not on the clock this time.
No, take as long as you need.
No, kidding. I've got two quick ones. So I think firstly, we've zoomed in on the menstrual cycle, you know, and how that might affect our ability to train or what we should eat. And I think we should zoom out. And I'm going to add to Dr. Helms, and I'm going to call that the gendered environment. I think that gendered environment is probably the big hitter. And, you know, let's come out, look at that. And we don't need to zoom in quite so much. And the other thing I was going to say is we have said menstrual cycle over and over again today. And what we haven't said is, depending on which country you live in, which sport you work with, sometimes maybe only a third of your female athletes will have a menstrual cycle. So we do need to broaden as well our sort of conversations and our knowledge around the other ovarian hormone profiles like hormonal contraception, pregnancy, menstrual dysfunctions, menopause, and so on. So yeah, more to think about. So let's just expand that out a little bit.